Over the last few weeks and months and even the last few years, there have been a lot of events that have occurred in our nation and in our world that are problematic for preachers at times. If you think about gun violence with Aurora and Sandy Hook and the Naval Shipyard, you think about violence against African Americans, particularly Mike Brown, Trayvon Martin, other events that have occurred over the last few years, and you think about the Supreme Court decisions around the Voting Rights Act, around same-sex marriage, around a number of events. There's just a lot going on around us. Right now, one of the things that has been pivotal around preaching has been the events that have taken place in Charleston, South Carolina. The massacre of 9 persons sitting around a Bible study table by a white supremacist. The massacre at Mother Emanuel AME Church has crystallized and made it impossible for preachers to ignore the fact that we have to address what's going on around us. When I teach preaching, one of the things I talk about is that we have to be attuned to our context. Not everyone has the same context. I had students who wrote to me shortly after the massacre and said, "I'm in an all-white context, what do I do?" And my response was simple. You have to address the context that you're in, but you have to challenge them to understand that the world around them is not exactly like theirs. You have to preach about racism, you have to preach about violence, you have to address the challenges of gun violence and how prevalent it is in our society. I had other students who were in all African American contexts that said, my folks get this, they live this on a regular basis. How do I talk about white privilege and not sound like I'm being angry as a black person? And I said to them, what we need to do is be in dialogue constantly, being aware of our context, but also challenging the norms in our own communities. And so in white contexts, we need to challenge them to understand racism, to acknowledge their white privilege, and to see the issues that are confronting their brothers and sisters of color. If we're in white context, in black context, we need to make sure that we acknowledge not only our own complicity in not lifting up the issues in environments that are mixed and calling our white brothers and sisters into accountability for the racism that they perpetuate, we have to honor where our context is. I've had the privilege over the last couple of months of supplying at Reformation Lutheran Church here in Philadelphia, which is an all-black congregation. As a white leader coming in to preach in the weeks following Charleston, I thought I need to bow out and not be the preacher for this week. And I questioned their leadership and said, should I bow out? Should we have someone else here during these weeks? And they said, no, you have a relationship with us, we trust you, and we want you to speak the truth. And I preached a sermon about violence, I preached a sermon about hate, I preached a sermon about racism and white privilege and about pain and anguish. And it's a sermon that I would preach in a white context as well. I would change it some, but not a lot. Because on those Sundays and in the following Sundays to come, I wanted to challenge the norms. And what have happened if there have been uprisings against the racial prejudice in our country and in lieu of it and in affirmation of it. We've seen black churches burned. We've seen people lift up the flag of the Army of Northern Virginia, never a Confederate flag, but they lift it up as a piece of heritage and history without owning the fact that this flag also represents racism and bigotry and hate and oppression and slavery. We have to name these things and call people into accountability. As a preacher of the gospel, that's my job. It's my job to honor the text, but also to challenge our context, to challenge our communities of faith, to decry these systems that continue oppression, to call institutional racism for what it is and challenging it into being done away with. It means that we sometimes comfort the afflicted, but we also have to afflict the comfortable. And many people are comfortable with the status quo of racism and oppression and violence in our country, and that's not okay. So I challenge you as preachers of the gospel, as hearers of the gospel, to challenge what's going on in the world around us, to challenge the norms in your community, to take on these hard topics. Maybe you begin those conversations in adult forums or in Sunday school classrooms or in special events where you come together to talk about racism and prejudice. But you also claim the gospel of Christ, that is a gospel of inclusion and love, forgiveness and peace from the pulpit. Read more in PS Portions about my article and others.